The kilobits per second kbps bitrate that you encoded your MP3 file at is really important to think about for podcasting. It won't change anything about the process of creating or maintaining your podcast, but it will have a lot to do with the listener's overall experience. Saving your mix at 128 or 320 will affect the sound quality, but the difference in file size also needs to be kept in mind. You want it to sound great, but you also want it to stream and download quickly, use up a minimal amount of your listeners' data for that month, and not take up too much space on their hard drive or phone. Transfer speeds are getting faster while storage gets cheaper and smaller, so this might not be such an issue one day, but don't assume that everybody has a great internet connection right now or an unlimited mobile data plan. Your podcast should be easily accessible to anybody in the world, so you'll have to find a balance between quality and size that you're comfortable with. It's better to decide on one bit rate for your RSS podcast files and try to be consistent, but there's no reason that you can't also offer a high and lower quality version of each episode from a page on your website to give people more options that match their different situations. A lot of talk-based podcasts will use the 64 to 96 kilobit range because the file size ends up being a lot smaller and sound quality is less important to them. Sometimes it won't even be necessary for them to be in stereo. If you're playing music though, it'll sound terrible at this bit rate and listeners might tune out. It's AM radio quality and not recommended for music. 128 to 192 is probably the lowest you'll want to go for a music podcast these days, but it'll be perfectly acceptable to a lot of listeners. Some people call it CD quality, but it's more like FM radio grade, and you'll definitely hear some crunchy MP3 distortion. It'll sound okay through small earbud headphones or newer computer speakers optimized for MP3s, but people will notice a lack of clarity on sound systems any better than those, like in a car or through nicer headphones. This bitrate is recommended as a lo-fi option on your website, or if your priority is faster downloads and smaller files over sound quality. You'll still hear some occasional MP3 pops and distortion at 256 kilobits, especially if the song is poorly recorded and already compressed a lot before it gets to you. It sounds twice as good as 128, but it's also twice as large. This is what I've been using for the last few years and think is probably the best balance between file size and audio quality for a music podcast right now. iTunes and Amazon have also been using this bitrate. Some people won't notice the better bass and crisper highs in their listening environment, but there are definitely enough music lovers that will appreciate the extra definition, so this is the one I recommend. 320 is the highest resolution MP3 file and the one closest to actual CD quality, but the file size will be getting pretty big for an hour-long podcast episode and will take longer to download. That won't be a concern for much longer, but maybe this is near the threshold where we should think about taking a step back on sound quality so that our podcast gives listeners enough of a taste, but without removing the need for them to actually purchase premium quality music from our favorite artists. In any case, this one is still only a quarter of the way to CD quality, but it might be considered close enough by most people's ears. For MP3 files that you want in your podcast channel, make sure to always use CBR, constant bitrate, instead of VBR, variable bitrate. VBR is more modern and will always give you smaller files and more optimized sound quality, but older players might have trouble reading them. It's not as much of a problem as it used to be, but sticking with CBR is still a safer bet for now. Also, keep the sample rate at 44.1 kHz so that all of your mixes are compatible with the widest range of media players and devices. Most audio software will give you another option to encode your MP3 file as either stereo or joint stereo using the mid-side or intensity stereo settings. Intensity stereo really won't help your music files, and it's a good idea to stay away from that one. It can be useful for adding some life to very low bit rates in the 64 to 96 kilobits per second range, but files any higher than that will end up sounding worse. In most situations, you'll want to stick with the stereo setting, especially for rock, jazz, funk, or disco. Basically, if your music was created by a band playing instruments, it was recorded in such a way so that the stereo image sounds exactly the way you would hear it if they were on stage in front of you. Electronic music is produced a little bit differently, and usually sounds more like it's built from bottom to top like a stack of speakers, instead of spread from left to right. A lot of the elements in a track designed for big sound systems will even be in mono, especially the bass sounds. Joint stereo encoding using the mid-side setting takes advantage of this fact by using one of its channels to store the audio information that's identical on both sides. The other channel is reserved for everything that's different between the left and right. It's a much more efficient way to encode an MP3, and the file size will always be smaller, but sometimes you'll also end up with better sound quality. You should experiment by encoding your show in both ways, and then deciding which one you like better, because it will vary a lot depending on the music that you feature in the mix. Test them out in a few different listening environments, and if you don't notice a difference, pick the one with a smaller file size for your podcast channel.